Discrimination and systemic bias. Captain Maya Daniels, an exceptionally qualified black female pilot, faces immediate discrimination at Meridian Airlines. She is unjustly reassigned on her first flight and subjected to a series of hazing tactics meant to push her out. Corruption and safety violations. Maya uncovers that Meridian Airlines is engaging in dangerous maintenance shortcuts, falsifying records, and pressuring employees to overlook safety issues to maximize profits. Building alliances, despite hostility. Maya finds allies in her co-pilot James, flight attendant Lauren, and maintenance technician Marcus, who secretly provide evidence of systemic misconduct. Courage to whistleblow. Maya collects overwhelming proof of Meridian's illegal practices and, with her sister Zoe, a lawyer, presents it to the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration, and investigative journalists. Corporate accountability and industry impact. As a result of Maya's actions, the FAA grounds 40% of Meridian's fleet. The airline's executives face criminal charges, and the company collapses, leading to a broader industry reckoning. Vindication and new beginnings. Maya is offered new opportunities at other airlines and aviation safety organizations. She joins Atlantic Airways, a reformed airline that prioritizes diversity and safety. Cultural and policy changes in aviation. Maya's actions inspire a shift in the aviation industry, leading to better hiring practices, whistleblower protections, and stronger safety regulations. Legacy of change and redemption. Years later, even former adversaries like Richard Whitmore acknowledge their mistakes. Maya becomes a leader in aviation safety, mentoring the next generation of pilots and ensuring that no one is ever unjustly left outside again. Ava Sinclair had always trusted the sky. It was the ground she didn't trust. At 37, she had spent more time in cockpits than she had in her own apartment. The sky had never betrayed her. It had never whispered behind her back, never second-guessed her abilities, never tried to clip her wings before she had the chance to fly. The sky followed one rule: respect it, and it would carry you safely home. The same could not be said for Meridian Airlines. It had started as a feeling, a tightness in her chest, a voice in the back of her head, telling her something wasn't right. Ava had learned long ago not to ignore that voice. And so, when she ran her fingers down the maintenance log of the Boeing 737 she was scheduled to fly, that voice screamed at her. The numbers didn't match. The intake valve inspection had been logged twice, once on the 10th, again on the 17th, but something was off. The signature on the second check was different, the ink fresher, as if someone had signed it after the fact. For the first time in her 20-year career, Ava felt something worse than discrimination, worse than doubt, worse than the constant weight of proving herself. She felt fear, not for herself, for the 243 passengers who would board this plane. Trusting that someone, somewhere, had done their job, she turned to James Chen, her first officer, who had been scanning his own checklist. He looked up at her, eyebrows raised. Something wrong, Captain? Ava hesitated. If she spoke, if she called attention to this, she knew exactly what would happen. They would call her difficult. They would say she was overreacting. They would accuse her of looking for problems that weren't there. But if she stayed silent? She thought of the families on board. The single mother taking her baby to see his grandparents for the first time. The young couple on their honeymoon, still believing in forever. The old man traveling alone, a folded newspaper tucked under his arm, heading somewhere he hadn't been in years. If she stayed silent, they were the ones who would pay the price. So Ava straightened her spine, lifted her chin, and said the words that would change everything. I want a secondary inspection before we take off. James frowned. Captain, that'll delay us. Then we delay. He hesitated, then gave a slow nod. Understood. It took 20 minutes for the inspection to be completed. 20 minutes that felt like an eternity. When the maintenance crew chief, Marcus Jefferson, a veteran mechanic with 23 years under his belt, walked up to her with a clipboard. His expression was grim. You were right, he said in a low voice. The intake valve wasn't checked properly. If we had taken off and hit turbulence. He trailed off. He didn't need to finish. Ava's stomach turned to ice. How did this happen? She demanded. Marcus hesitated. Then he exhaled sharply, glancing over his shoulder as if making sure no one was listening. Because we're told to sign off on things we shouldn't. He muttered. They're rushing us, pushing more flights, cutting turnaround times. They're finding ways to bypass certain protocols. If you ask too many questions, you're out. That's why I kept my mouth shut. Ava's breath caught. Rushing inspections? Ignoring safety protocols? This isn't just a one-time mistake, is it? She asked. Marcus looked at her then, really looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw the truth. This wasn't an accident. This was systemic. No, Captain, he said finally, his voice low and tired. It's not. Ava felt a cold dread settle in her chest. She had known Meridian was hostile. She had known they resented her presence. But she had never considered that they were putting lives at risk. That night, she didn't sleep. She pored over maintenance logs, cross-referenced FAA safety reports, and read through employee reviews on whistleblower websites. She found 3 lawsuits, all settled quietly, all involving safety concerns. She found an FAA investigation from 8 months ago, one that had ended with minor discrepancies and no further action taken. And then, buried in a news article no one had paid attention to, she found Paul Decker, a mechanic, one of the best, had started raising concerns about engine mounts on the 787s. 3 weeks later, he fell from a maintenance platform. A broken back. Career over. Meridian called it employee negligence. Ava sat in the darkness of her apartment, the glow of her laptop illuminating the evidence in front of her. This wasn't just risky corporate behavior. This wasn't just profit over people. This was criminal. Her hand hovered over her phone. She thought of the passengers, the mothers, the fathers, the children. Then she dialed the number. When her sister Zoe, a fierce corporate lawyer, picked up, she didn't waste time on pleasantries. I need you to connect me with your contact at the FAA. A pause. Then, Ava, what's going on? Ava stared at the documents in front of her, her pulse pounding. Meridian is cutting corners. They're falsifying safety records. And if I don't do something about it, someone is going to die. She heard Zoe inhale sharply. Are you sure? Ava's jaw tightened. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. A long silence. Then Zoe's voice, quiet but firm. Okay, tell me everything. Ava closed her eyes, taking a deep breath, because once she started talking, there would be no going back. She had spent her whole life fighting to be seen, to be respected, to be given a seat at the table. Now, she was fighting for something far bigger. And this time, she would not be silenced. Ava Sinclair had spent her entire career learning how to navigate the sky. But learning how to navigate people, that had been a much harder lesson. Trust was a currency she had never been able to spend freely. Too many times, it had been betrayed, stolen, or used against her. At Meridian Airlines, it became clear within days that she was being set up to fail. She wasn't just facing hostility, she was being systematically isolated, reassigned, humiliated, and placed under captains who treated her like an outsider in her own profession. And yet, even in the bleakest storms, there were stars. Ava found her first flicker of light in James Chen, her assigned first officer. James was young, sharp, and ambitious, but he lacked the cutthroat nature of men like Whitmore and Wilson. Unlike them, he saw her. The day she was pulled from her first flight, the moment she had been told to wait outside, while another captain took her seat. James had been the only one to come out and tell her the truth. It's bullshit, Captain. His voice had been low but firm. Angry, even. They said it's standard for new captains. But that's a lie. None of the others were pulled like this. Ava had studied him carefully. Then why tell me? James hesitated. Then, he looked her straight in the eye. Because you deserve to know when you're being played. From that moment on, she knew he was different. But one ally wouldn't be enough. Meridian wasn't just a bad workplace. It was a fortress, one built on decades of unchecked power. On fear, on tradition. It wasn't going to fall with one person speaking up. It would take many. She met Lauren Kim 2 weeks later. Lauren was a flight attendant with nearly a decade at Meridian. She was effortless in her composure, professional to the core, and always watching. They crossed paths one afternoon in the crew lounge, where Ava sat alone at a table, drinking a cup of cold, stale coffee, poring over maintenance logs that didn't add up. Lauren sat down without asking, folded her hands neatly, and in a voice so low it barely carried, she said, I know what they're doing to you. Ava froze. Excuse me? Lauren took out her phone, scrolling for a second before turning the screen toward Ava. It was a photo. A pressure valve. A crack running down the seam. Ava's blood ran cold. Flight 336. Toronto route. They cleared it to fly even after we reported it. That plane should have been grounded. Ava swallowed hard. Why are you showing me this? Lauren exhaled, glancing over her shoulder before leaning in slightly. Because I've been taking photos for months. Because I can't fix it alone. That was the moment Ava realized she wasn't alone. There were people watching. People scared to speak. People waiting for someone else to start the fight. And maybe, just maybe, she was the one who was meant to start it. Her final ally was Marcus Jefferson, the man who knew the bones of Meridian better than anyone. Marcus had been with the airline for 23 years. He had seen pilots come and go, executives rise and fall, safety regulations bent and broken. He had also seen good men ruined for asking the wrong questions. Ava met him in Maintenance Bay 34, under the guise of learning company procedures. The truth was, she needed answers. Captain Sinclair, he greeted her, eyeing her warily. She didn't waste time. How bad is it? Marcus studied her for a long moment before rubbing a hand down his tired face. Bad. That was it. One word, but it carried the weight of 1,000 hidden truths. How bad? She pressed. Marcus sighed. 30% of this fleet has issues that should ground them. But management pressures us to clear them anyway. More flights. Less downtime. Less downtime. More profit. Ava's stomach twisted. And if you don't play along? Marcus let out a dry, humorless chuckle. Then you end up like Paul Decker. Ava's hands clenched into fists. Paul Decker. The best mechanic they had. The one who started asking questions about engine mounts on the 787s. 3 weeks later, he fell. Ava whispered. It wasn't an accident, was it? Marcus shook his head, his eyes haunted. No, Captain, it wasn't. In that moment, Ava Sinclair made a choice. She had come to Meridian for a career. She had come to fly. She had never expected to become a soldier in a war she hadn't asked for. But now, she had James. She had Lauren. She had Marcus. And they had her. Together, they had the truth. The question was, what would they do with it? For the first time since stepping foot into this company, Ava wasn't afraid. She wasn't alone. And together, they were going to burn Meridian Airlines to the ground. Ava Sinclair had never been afraid of turbulence. She had flown through raging thunderstorms, battled winds that threatened to tear planes apart, and landed in zero visibility conditions where the only thing between her and disaster was her training and sheer willpower. But this was a different kind of storm. This was facing men in suits who had built their careers on silence. This was standing against an airline that had buried truth so deep that no one had dared to unearth it. This was not just about flying. This was about life and death. And Ava was done waiting for permission to speak. She sat at her apartment desk, the glow of her laptop casting long shadows across the walls. Before her was a collection of evidence that could destroy everything. Falsified maintenance logs, photos of damaged aircraft cleared for flight, internal emails urging mechanics to sign off on incomplete repairs. Testimonies from pilots and crew too afraid to speak publicly. Everything was there. Enough to bring down Meridian Airlines. Enough to ruin careers. Enough to make sure no one ever had to fear stepping onto one of their flights again. Her hands hovered over her phone. The number had been saved in her contacts for weeks. But she had never had the courage to press call. Until now. She took a deep breath. And then, she dialed. Zoe Daniels, legal counsel speaking. Ava's sister was sharp, brilliant, and relentless. Qualities that made her an incredible lawyer and, in moments like this, a terrifying force of nature. Zoe. Ava's voice came out steadier than she expected. Ava? Zoe's voice immediately shifted from professional to personal. It's late. What's wrong? Ava closed her eyes. I need your help. And I need you to connect me with your contact at the FAA. A beat of silence. Then Zoe's voice. Quiet but razor sharp. Ava, what have you found? Ava looked at the screen in front of her. The faces of passengers boarding planes they never should have been on. The documents proving how Meridian Airlines had lied. Again and again. To cover up safety failures. The whispers of men like Marcus. Who had seen good people broken for trying to tell the truth. Everything. She heard Zoe inhale sharply. And you're sure? Ava swallowed. I've never been more sure of anything in my life. Another pause. Then Zoe's tone hardened. I'll make the call. The next morning, Ava sat across from two FAA investigators in a quiet corner of an office downtown. The room was sterile, windowless, a place where truth was meant to be dissected, examined, and either discarded or set in motion. The man across from her adjusted his glasses. Captain Sinclair, we've received numerous complaints about Meridian in the past, but none have been substantial enough for formal action. What makes yours different? Ava met his gaze without flinching. She reached into her bag and placed a folder onto the table. This. The investigator flipped it open. The room was silent except for the sound of turning pages. Then he stopped. Is this real? He asked, looking up sharply. Ava nodded. Check the timestamps, the emails, the flight records. It's all there. The second investigator, a woman with a practiced poker face, picked up another sheet of paper. This states that an aircraft with a documented valve crack was cleared to fly despite it failing initial inspection. Do you have proof of this? Ava pulled out her phone, swiped, turned the screen toward them. A high-resolution photo, taken by Lauren Kim, showing the crack in the pressure valve. The investigator's eyes hardened. And who else knows about this? Ava exhaled. Enough people that if anything happens to me, this story won't disappear. The room shifted. A realization settled in. This wasn't just a complaint. This was a reckoning. The male investigator closed the folder. We'll take it from here, Captain. Ava nodded, but she wasn't done yet. I also sent copies of this to the Chicago Tribune. Their investigative journalist team will be publishing by the end of the week. So if Meridian tries to cover this up, you won't just have an FAA violation on your hands. She leaned forward. You'll have a national scandal. By the time Ava walked out of the building, she felt something she hadn't felt in weeks. Air in her lungs, weight off her shoulders. She had spent her entire career fighting to be seen, to be respected, to be given a place in the cockpit. Now, she had fought for something bigger. Not for herself. For every passenger who sat in a plane, believing they were safe. For every mechanic forced to choose between their job and their conscience. For every pilot told to wait outside, while others played with lives. She had done it, and there was no turning back. The story hit 3 days later. It exploded. News anchors used words like whistleblower, scandal, and criminal negligence. FAA officials were forced to launch a full-scale investigation. Meridian Airlines scrambled to contain the damage, but it was too late. And Ava? She was summoned to a meeting. Not with Meridian, with the Department of Justice. Because this wasn't just corporate misconduct anymore. This was a crime, and Ava Sinclair had lit the match that would burn it all down. To everyone reading, if you've made it this far, I need you. If you believe in truth, in justice, in holding those in power accountable. Like this post, comment your thoughts, share this story. Ava Sinclair stood alone when she stepped into that meeting room. But now, she has all of us behind her. And together, we're going to make sure the sky is safe for everyone. Ava Sinclair hadn't slept in 3 days. She had spent years preparing for high-stakes flights. For split-second decisions at 35,000 feet. For emergencies where the difference between life and death depended on her ability to remain calm under pressure. But nothing had prepared her for this storm. Because this wasn't just about a single flight. This wasn't about one aircraft with a faulty valve. Or one captain being discriminated against. This was about an entire airline built on lies, deception, and greed. And the world was about to find out the truth. The FAA investigation launched within hours of Ava's meeting. It wasn't a quiet inquiry. This was war. Inspectors descended on every Meridian Airlines hub, combing through maintenance logs, questioning mechanics, auditing flight schedules, and grounding planes left and right. Within 24 hours, 40% of Meridian's fleet was deemed unfit to fly. Within 48 hours, passengers were stranded across the country. Their flights canceled without warning. And by the end of the week, Meridian Airlines had become a household name, not for prestige, not for excellence, but for the scandal that shook the aviation industry to its core. The media tore into everything Ava had uncovered. National news anchors repeated her findings with shock and horror. Meridian Airlines knowingly flew unsafe aircraft, falsified maintenance records, and retaliated against employees who spoke up. Passengers were put at risk for the sake of profit. How deep does this corruption go? The Chicago Tribune, which had received copies of Ava's evidence, ran a 4-page exposé with a headline that sent chills through the industry. Flying on Lies. How Meridian Airlines Put Profits Before Passenger Safety. And at the heart of it all, there was one name that wouldn't be forgotten. Ava Sinclair, the whistleblower, the captain who wouldn't be silenced, the woman who stood against the machine and won. Inside Meridian's executive boardroom, panic spread like wildfire. Thomas Barrett, the man who had once ordered Ava to wait outside, now found himself locked inside a room with federal investigators. His face was ashen as the FAA officials presented their findings. Hundreds of safety violations, dozens of falsified records, and one damning truth that could not be ignored: Meridian Airlines had knowingly endangered the lives of its passengers. This isn't just negligence, Mr. Barrett, one investigator said coldly. This is criminal. And just like that, the once untouchable executives of Meridian Airlines were no longer above the law. They were under investigation for fraud, reckless endangerment, and obstruction of justice. For the first time in his 30-year career, Barrett had no power. No legal team could bury the truth. No press statement could undo the damage. And no amount of money could make this go away. Ava watched it all unfold from a distance. She saw the headlines. She watched the press conferences where Meridian's leaders fumbled through weak apologies. She listened as passengers demanded answers. As former employees came forward with their own stories of being silenced. As the public lost all trust in the airline that had once been considered one of America's finest. And then, just when she thought she had seen it all, the final blow came. Meridian Airlines filed for bankruptcy. Their operating certificate was revoked. And the airline that had tried to break her was now the one being grounded permanently. James Chen called her that night. "It's over," he said. Ava exhaled, her grip tightening around the phone. "Yeah," she whispered. "It is. You did it, Captain." She shook her head. "We did it, James. All of us." Because it had never been about her alone. It had been Marcus Jefferson, the mechanic who had risked everything to tell the truth. It had been Lauren Kim, the flight attendant who had kept records of every unsafe flight. It had been James, Zoe, the Tribune journalists, the FAA investigators. Every single person who had chosen truth over silence. And now? Now, they had won. 3 months later, the industry was still reeling from the aftermath of Meridian's collapse. Other airlines scrambled to conduct internal safety audits, afraid they'd be next on the chopping block. Legislation was introduced to strengthen protections for whistleblowers in aviation. And in the ultimate twist of irony, Ava received an offer from one of Meridian's competitors, Atlantic Airways. Not just any position, a leadership role, Director of Aviation Safety. The company's CEO told her, "We don't just want a captain. We want someone who isn't afraid to fight for what's right." Ava accepted the job without hesitation. Because this fight wasn't just about Meridian Airlines. It was about changing the industry forever. And now, she had the power to do exactly that. To everyone who has followed this journey, Ava Sinclair didn't just stand up for herself. She stood up for everyone who has ever been told to stay quiet. To look the other way. To accept that, this is just how things are. She refused. She fought. And because of that, an entire industry was forced to change. If you believe in truth, in justice, in holding corporations accountable, drop a comment below. Let Ava know that her courage mattered. Because sometimes, one voice is all it takes to bring down an empire. And this? This was only the beginning. 1. The last walk through Meridian's ruins. Ava Sinclair stood outside Meridian Airlines headquarters, staring at the crumbling empire she had brought down. The company's once polished logo was half removed, the edges jagged where workers had peeled the letters from the glass. The building, once bustling with pilots and executives who thought they were untouchable, was now nearly empty. She stepped through the doors one last time. No one stopped her. No security guards watching her every move. No hostile stares from executives who saw her as a threat. No whispers of, "She won't last here." Because she had lasted. And they hadn't. 2. The final blow. Justice catches up. Meridian's former executives had tried to run. Tried to hide behind expensive lawyers. But justice had caught up. Thomas Barrett, Richard Whitmore, Harold Wilson, the men who had conspired to silence her, were now public disgraces. The Department of Justice had formally charged them with fraud, reckless endangerment, and obstruction of justice. Their legacy? Not as respected airline leaders, but as criminals who had gambled with innocent lives. Ava watched the news reports. The grainy footage of Barrett being escorted into court, his face gray with exhaustion. Captain Sinclair, the reporter said on screen, the woman who exposed one of the biggest scandals in aviation history. Her name, once whispered in doubt, was now spoken with respect. And for the first time in her career, she wasn't fighting to be seen. The world saw her now. 3. The offer that changed everything. A week later, she received the call that would change her life. Ava, this is David Reynolds, CEO of Atlantic Airways. She recognized the name immediately. Atlantic was one of the top airlines in the world, known for their commitment to safety. Not like Meridian. We don't just want you as a pilot. Reynolds continued, we want you to help change the industry. We want you to lead our aviation safety division. Ava sat in stunned silence. All her life, she had fought for a seat at the table. Now, they were offering her the entire damn room. What do you say, Captain? She didn't hesitate. When do I start? 4. The dangerous flight that nearly ended it all. Her first flight with Atlantic Airways was a routine cross-country trip, Chicago to San Francisco. At least, it should have been. At 32,000 feet, the alarms went off. Engine failure. The right engine coughed, then cut out completely. Ava's pulse spiked. The aircraft lurched violently, the cabin tilting as passengers screamed. We're losing thrust. Her first officer, Tasha Williams, shouted. Ava had faced many battles in her life, but none had been as immediate, as deadly, as this. This wasn't a boardroom fight. This wasn't corrupt executives playing games with safety regulations. This was real, and if she didn't act fast, 243 lives would be lost. I've got control, Ava said, her voice steady despite the chaos. She fought against the violent shuddering of the aircraft, stabilizing it even as it plummeted thousands of feet. Oxygen masks dropped from the ceiling. Flight attendants calmed the panicked passengers, their voices tight with barely restrained fear. Ava's hands worked by instinct, adjusting speed, angle, drag, everything she had ever learned in her thousands of hours in the sky. She would not let this plane go down. Not today. After a harrowing 7 minutes, she stabilized the aircraft and made an emergency landing in Denver. The moment the wheels touched down, the entire cabin erupted in applause and tears. As she stepped into the terminal, passengers approached her, gripping her hands, thanking her through sobs. You saved us, Captain. But what they didn't know, what none of them could know, was that they had saved her. 2. Because in that moment, Ava realized something. No executive could take away what she was meant to do. She wasn't just a whistleblower. She was a pilot, and the sky was hers again. 5. A legacy forged in fire. Months later, she stood at Atlantic Airways headquarters, now wearing a new uniform, one with 4 gold stripes and the title of Director of Aviation Safety. She wasn't just flying planes. She was rewriting the rules. She had worked with the FAA to create stricter safety regulations. She had ensured that no airline would ever cut corners without consequence again. And she had made sure that people like Marcus, Lauren, and James, those who had risked everything for the truth, found their own places in this new future. The industry had changed, and Ava Sinclair was the reason why. 6. The final flight home. One night, Ava sat alone, looking out at the runway lights. She thought of her father, the man who had told her, "You'll have to be twice as good to get half as far." She had been twice as good. She had been 3 times as strong. And now? She had gone twice as far as anyone had ever expected. Her phone buzzed with a message from James. "They're adding your name to the Aviation Hall of Honor. It's official. Captain, you changed the game." Ava smiled. She wasn't looking for recognition. She had never fought for fame. She had fought because it was right. Because no one deserved to fear the sky. Because no one else should have to stand alone. To everyone listening, this isn't just Ava's story. This is a story of truth. A story of courage. A story of refusing to accept that this is just the way things are. If you believe in justice, if you believe in accountability, If you believe in people like Ava Sinclair who risk everything to protect lives, comment below. Let her know that she wasn't alone. Because the sky belongs to all of us. And tonight, as she watched another plane take off into the star-lit horizon, Ava Sinclair finally understood. She had won. Ava Sinclair never set out to change the aviation industry. She had never planned to be the center of a scandal, the face of a movement, or the reason a once powerful airline collapsed under the weight of its own corruption. All she had wanted was to fly. But fate had other plans. And now, because of her fight, because of the truth she refused to bury, the entire industry had been forced to reckon with its own sins. 1. The FAA's historic response. It had started with Meridian's collapse. Once the investigations exposed the full extent of the airline's crimes, the Federal Aviation Administration could no longer ignore the deeper problems in the industry. For years, aviation had been built on unspoken rules, an old guard protecting its own, a culture that punished those who spoke out instead of those who endangered lives. Ava's case shattered that system. A national audit was conducted across every major airline. Hundreds of internal safety reports surfaced, issues that had been buried, ignored, or manipulated to keep planes in the air at any cost. But this time, they couldn't sweep it under the rug. This time, someone had stood up and refused to be silenced. This time, Ava Sinclair had forced them to listen. And the industry would never be the same again. 2. The rise of the Whistleblower Protection Act for aviation workers. Ava had paid the price for telling the truth. She had been reassigned, humiliated, and threatened, but she had survived it. Others hadn't. Marcus Jefferson, the mechanic who had risked his job to share what he knew, had nearly lost everything before Atlantic Airways offered him a role as head of maintenance quality control. Lauren Kim, the flight attendant who had documented safety violations, had been on the verge of quitting the industry entirely, until new policies ensured her protection from retaliation. They had been lucky. Thousands of others, pilots, engineers, flight attendants, had lost their careers for doing what was right. But now, the industry had no choice but to change. Congress passed the Whistleblower Protection Act for aviation workers, preventing airlines from firing, blacklisting, or retaliating against employees who reported safety concerns. For the first time, truth-tellers were no longer the ones being punished. Now, it was the companies that ignored them who paid the price. 3. The end of the old guard in cockpits. Ava had fought 2 battles at Meridian Airlines. One was against the corruption that put passengers at risk. The other? Against the men who looked at her and saw nothing but a mistake. Captain Harold Wilson had once told her, "This airline has traditions. Not everyone fits. But traditions evolve." And now, so did the hiring process. Under the new Aviation Diversity and Merit Act, airlines were required to adopt a blind application system for pilots. Names were removed from initial hiring documents. No more subtle biases. No more, "She doesn't look like a pilot," excuses. You were judged by your skills, your flight hours, your competency, not by your gender, not by your race. For years, women and minorities had been told aviation wasn't meant for them. Now, the sky belonged to everyone. 4. The industry that feared her, now needed her. Ava never thought she'd set foot in another boardroom after what Meridian had put her through. But after the dust settled, after Meridian crumbled and the industry scrambled to repair its broken reputation, something unexpected happened. The airlines that once saw her as a problem, now wanted her as their solution. She received calls from industry leaders, companies desperate to rebuild trust. They didn't just need a pilot. They needed a leader. Ava didn't forgive easily. She didn't forget. But she knew what was at stake. She knew that turning them down would only let the old systems fester in silence again. And so, she stepped into a new role, not just as a captain, but as a policymaker, a consultant, a voice in every room that had once tried to shut her out. She sat across from executives who had once dismissed her. She looked them in the eye. And she told them exactly how they were going to fix the industry they had broken. 5. The next generation of pilots looked different because of her. Ava remembered the first time she walked into a pilot's lounge and felt the air shift. The glances, the whispers, the unspoken question in their eyes. What is she doing here? Now, she walked through Atlantic Airways' training facility and saw something different. She saw women in captains' uniforms. She saw young Black and Asian pilots reviewing flight plans together. She saw something she had rarely seen before: belonging. One day, a young woman with nervous hands and determined eyes stopped her in the hallway. "Captain Sinclair?" Ava turned. The girl swallowed, then stood a little taller. "I just wanted to say, what you did at Meridian. What you fought for, it's why I kept going." Ava smiled. She saw herself in this girl. All the doubt, all the exhaustion, all the moments of nearly walking away. "You keep going," Ava told her, "and don't let anyone tell you to wait outside." The girl nodded, and Ava knew, right then, that the industry she had once fought to stay in had finally changed. Not just for her, but for every pilot who came after. To everyone listening, Ava didn't just change aviation, she changed what was possible. She fought when no one else would. She spoke when they told her to be silent. And now, the sky no longer belonged to the few who thought they could control it. It belonged to all of us. If you believe in courage, in justice, in fighting for what is right no matter the cost, drop a comment below. Let Ava Sinclair know that her battle was worth it. Because in the end, she didn't just prove she belonged in the sky. She made sure everyone else could, too. Ava Sinclair never expected to hear from Richard Whitmore again. Years had passed since she had stood in that executive boardroom, forcing Meridian Airlines to face the truth they had tried to bury. The company was gone, its legacy reduced to cautionary tales and court cases. Ava had moved on, had built something greater than she ever imagined. And yet, as she read the email from Whitmore, she felt a flicker of something unexpected, not triumph, not satisfaction, but something deeper. Regret, not hers, his. The message was brief, but every word carried the weight of a man who had spent too long running from the truth. "Captain Sinclair," it began, "you may be surprised to hear from me. After much reflection during my community service sentence, I've come to recognize the harm caused by my actions and attitudes. While nothing can undo the past, I wanted you to know that your courage forced me to confront truths I had spent a lifetime avoiding. The aviation world is better because you refused to be silenced. For whatever it's worth, after all this time, I am sorry." Ava sat back in her chair, staring at the screen, emotions warring within her. Once, she had hated Whitmore, the way he had smirked when she was forced to wait outside. The way he had spoken down to her. The way he had tried to strip her of everything she had worked for. But hate was too heavy a burden to carry. And she had won. Not just against him, not just against Meridian Airlines. She had won against the very system that had tried to break her. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. For a long time, she considered leaving his apology unanswered. But then, she thought of the lesson her father had taught her long ago. Forgiveness isn't about letting them off the hook. It's about setting yourself free. Ava exhaled and typed back 2 simple words. Apology accepted. And just like that, the past was finally behind her. A new era of aviation begins. Ava's story didn't end when Meridian fell. It didn't end when the executives faced justice. It didn't even end when she became the director of aviation safety at Atlantic Airways. No, her story was just beginning. Because now, she wasn't just fighting for herself. She was fighting for the future. 1. A seat at the table, and a new mission. 3 years after the scandal, Ava sat in a high-rise conference room, looking out over the city skyline. But this time, she wasn't being pushed out. She wasn't being ignored. She was leading the conversation. The FAA had created a new aviation safety oversight committee, and Ava had been selected as one of its key members. Her job? To ensure that what happened at Meridian never happened again. To write policies that protected pilots, mechanics, and passengers from corporate greed. To be the voice for those who had once been silenced. She looked around the table, seeing the new generation of leaders, people who had been inspired by her fight. Her defiance, her refusal to give up. And she realized something. She had become the change she once needed. 2. Training the next generation. One day, during a flight from Los Angeles to New York, Ava noticed a young Black woman in a pilot's uniform standing by the gate. The girl looked nervous but determined, a familiar sight. Ava approached her with a smile. "First officer or training?" she asked. The woman straightened, eyes wide. "Training, Captain. Just finished my final simulator test. I start co-piloting next month." Ava saw herself in this young pilot, all the struggles, all the doubts, all the moments where she had questioned whether she belonged. And she smiled. Then welcome to the sky. And if anyone ever tells you that you don't belong here? She met the young woman's eyes, letting the words sink in. Tell them the sky doesn't have doors, only horizons. The woman grinned, standing a little taller. And in that moment, Ava knew the industry had changed. Not because the old guard had been removed, but because the new guard was here to stay. Lessons from Ava's story. What we can all take away. Ava's journey wasn't just about flying. It wasn't just about exposing corruption. It was about something bigger, something we can all apply in our lives. Never let anyone tell you to wait outside. Whether it's in your career, in your passions, or in your dreams, you have every right to be in the room. The truth is worth fighting for, even when it costs you. Ava risked everything to speak up. And in the end, she saved lives. Forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting. It means freeing yourself. Holding on to hate won't undo the past. But moving forward? That's where true power lies. Lift others up as you climb. Ava fought not just for herself, but for the next generation. And because of her, the future of aviation looked different. And finally, the sky belongs to all of us. No matter where you come from, no matter who doubts you, your dreams are valid, and no one has the right to take them from you. Ava's final flight, the ending she deserved. 5 years after bringing down Meridian Airlines, Ava Sinclair sat once again in the cockpit of a Boeing 787. Only this time, she wasn't shadowing anyone. She wasn't being questioned. She was the captain. Her hands moved over the controls with familiar ease. Her heart steady as she guided the plane through the clouds. From the first officer seat, a young woman with bright eyes and steady hands checked the instruments. "Beautiful day for flying, Captain," she said with a grin. Ava smiled. The best kind. As the aircraft soared over the horizon, she thought about everything it had taken to get here. The battles, the losses, the victories, and most of all, the people who had stood beside her when she refused to back down. Because in the end, this wasn't just her story. It was all of ours. To everyone listening, Ava Sinclair's story is more than just a story. It's a reminder. A reminder that we all have the power to change the world. A reminder that silence is never the answer. A reminder that sometimes, one voice is all it takes to bring down an empire. So if you believe in courage, in justice, in never backing down from what's right, drop a comment below. Let Ava know that her fight mattered. And most importantly, subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories like this. Because this was only the beginning.